In a galaxy where every thought was never truly your own, silence was the rarest thing you could fear. The chamber was built for control, not comfort, a seamless oval of white alloy walls that hummed softly with layered frequencies designed to stabilize neural resonance. Overhead panels casting a sterile glow that erased all shadows. And at the center stood Princess Lysera Vaughn, perfectly still, her silver blue eyes unfocused as thousands of voices streamed through her mind at once. Diplomats whispering strategies, guards counting their breaths, technicians worrying about calibration drift. Measured in fractions of a millisecond, all of it constant, all of it unavoidable, the endless chorus of a galaxy that had never learned to be quiet. And she bore it the way she had since childhood, not with ease, but with discipline, her spine straight, her breathing measured at exactly 6 cycles per minute, her presence alone enough to command silence in the physical world even if her mind could never escape the noise, until the doors behind her parted with a soft hydraulic sigh and something impossible happened. The moment he stepped inside, the voices stopped, not faded, not dimmed, but cut cleanly as if a switch had been thrown somewhere beyond physics or protocol. And for the first time in her life, Lysera felt the absence of sound press against her thoughts like a vacuum, sudden and absolute. Her composure faltering for just a fraction of a second as her gaze locked onto the human standing 10 feet away. Average height, maybe 6 feet even, wearing a worn utility jacket with grease stains along the sleeves, his posture relaxed in a way that bordered on careless, hands empty, expression neutral, and yet he was the source of it. The void, the silence that swallowed everything else. She reached instinctively, her mind extending outward with precision honed over decades, brushing against the nearest guard first, confirming the baseline, his thoughts flickering with routine vigilance. Then the technician near the console, anxiety spiking as he noticed the anomaly in her biometric readings, all of it loud, predictable, alive. And then she turned that same focus toward the human, and there was nothing, no static, no resistance, no hidden layer or shielded frequency, just absence. Like trying to listen for an echo in a room that had never existed, her pulse stuttered once, a subtle hitch that no one else in the chamber would have noticed. But to her it felt like the ground had shifted beneath her feet. She took a single step forward, the soft click of her boots the only sound now that mattered, stopping exactly 3 feet from him, close enough to study the details. Light brown hair slightly unkempt, eyes steady but not defiant, just present, and still nothing, no trace of thought, no emotional signature, no mental pattern to decode. She pushed harder, carefully, increasing the intensity of her reach by calibrated increments, the way she would when encountering encrypted minds or unfamiliar species. But instead of resistance, she felt a strange recoil, not from him, but from herself, as if her ability simply had nowhere to anchor. The silence remained intact, untouched, and for the first time since she had been trained to rule, Lysera Vaughn did not understand what she was facing. Her voice, when it finally came, was controlled, even, but beneath it lay something new, something knew how to wear. The lead technician hesitated for half a second before complying, fingers moving quickly across the interface. We are already at maximum sensitivity. Your Highness, there is nothing to amplify. She did not look at him, her attention fixed entirely on Ethan, as if by watching closely enough, she could force reality to make sense again. Then measure the absence, she replied. And even as she said it, she knew how absurd it sounded, because absence was not something her people had ever needed to measure. Everything in their world was connection, signal, thought layered upon thought in an endless exchange. And yet here stood a man who broke that foundation simply by existing. Ethan shifted his weight slightly, the movement small but deliberate, his boots making a soft sound against the polished floor. If it helps, he said, his voice even and unhurried. I am not doing anything. A few of the guards exchanged glances, unease flickering through their thoughts like static. Lysera felt it instantly, the contrast almost jarring after the void surrounding him. She raised a hand subtly, and the room stilled again, not physically, but in intent, discipline tightening every mind into silence they knew she could enforce. Accept his. Always accept his. She took another step closer, now within arm's reach, close enough to notice the faint scent of machine oil on his jacket, the small scar along his knuckle. Details that grounded him in something ordinary, something real, and that only made the impossibility worse. "Everyone does something," she said, softer now. Not a command, but an observation. "Every mind leaves a trace." Ethan met her gaze without flinching, not challenging, not submissive, just steady. "Maybe you are just used to listening for things that want to be heard." The answer landed differently than she expected, not as defiance, but as a statement that carried no hidden layer, no second meaning she could peel back, because there was nothing beneath it to read. And for a brief moment Lysera realized something far more unsettling than the silence itself. She could not tell if he was lying. The thought lingered, unfamiliar and sharp. She had always known, always seen the truth behind every word spoken in her presence. It was the foundation of her power, her certainty, and now that certainty had been replaced with something fragile and undefined, curiosity edged with something dangerously close to vulnerability. The technician's voice broke through her focus, hesitant, careful. "Your Highness, the system is registering a localized dampening field, but it is not emitting from him. It is centered on him, as if the effect exists because he does." Lysera absorbed the words slowly, her eyes never leaving Ethan, and for the first time since he had entered the room. She did not try to reach into his mind. She simply stood there in the quiet he carried with him, feeling it settle around her like a space she had never been allowed to enter before, and she realized with a clarity that both steadied and unsettled her. This was not just an anomaly to be studied. It was something she could not control, and that made it the most dangerous thing she had ever encountered. The chamber door sealed with a soft magnetic lock behind him, not a prison in design, but in function, and yet Ethan Cole did not look like a man who felt confined. He stood near the observation glass with his hands resting loosely at his sides, watching the faint reflection of the room rather than the stars beyond it, as if he had already decided there was nothing out there he needed to understand. Lysera remained several feet away, her posture composed but no longer rigid, the distance between them carefully measured, not by protocol this time, but by something more uncertain, something she had not yet named. The rest of the staff had been dismissed minutes earlier, their thoughts a constant distraction she could no longer tolerate, leaving only the low, ambient hum of the station's life support systems and the steady rhythm of her own breathing, and his, always his, grounding the silence that surrounded him like an invisible boundary. She had ordered continuous scans, layered diagnostics, cross-referenced analyses from 3 separate scientific divisions, and all of them had returned the same answer in different words. He was not projecting interference, he was not shielding his mind, he was not even resisting her. He simply existed outside the framework her entire species relied on, and that realization had shifted something fundamental inside her. Because power had always meant understanding, and understanding had always come from access, but now there was a part of reality she could not access at all. "You are not afraid," she said finally, breaking the quiet not because she needed information, but because she needed to hear something that was not filtered through 1,000 jerk thoughts. Ethan glanced toward her, not quickly, not sharply, just a natural turn of attention. "Should I be?" he replied, his tone calm, not dismissive, not challenging, just genuinely curious. And again she felt it, that absence of hidden intent, no spike of adrenaline, no flicker of deception, just the surface of the words and nothing beneath. She stepped closer, reducing the distance by a single measured foot, her boots silent against the polished floor. "Most beings are, when they realize they are completely visible to me," she said, watching him carefully, searching his face now instead of his mind, adjusting to a form of perception she had never needed before. Ethan considered that for a moment, his eyes drifting briefly toward the ceiling as if following a thought she could not hear, then returning to her. "That sounds exhausting," he said, and the simplicity of it caught her off guard more than any resistance could have, because it was not framed as admiration or fear, but as concern, quiet and unforced. She felt her shoulders shift, just slightly, the tension she had carried for years easing in a way she had never allowed herself to notice. "It is necessary," she replied, though the words felt less certain than they should have. Without it, there would be no order. Ethan gave a small nod, acknowledging the logic without fully agreeing. Maybe, he said, then after a brief pause added, but order is not the same as peace. The distinction lingered in the air between them, unspoken but undeniable. Lycera studied him more closely now. The subtle movements of his breathing, the way his weight shifted evenly between his feet, the lack of any defensive posture despite his situation. And she realized something else that unsettled her in a quieter, deeper way. Without access to his thoughts, she had to trust what she could see, and trust was not something her position had ever required. The realization felt unfamiliar, almost fragile. She moved past him slowly, circling to stand beside him at the observation glass. Their reflections faint against the vast darkness beyond, and for a moment neither of them spoke, the silence stretching not as a void this time, but as something shared, something stable. She focused on it, the absence of noise not as a loss, but as a presence of something else, something she had never experienced before. And when she finally spoke again, her voice was quieter than it had ever been in this room. Stay, she said, not as a command, but as a request she did not fully understand. And that, more than anything, was what frightened her the most. The word lingered between them longer than it should have, not because it was unclear, but because it carried a weight she had never placed on a single syllable before. Stay, not an order reinforced by rank or expectation, but something quieter, something uncertain. Ethan did not answer immediately, and for the first time since entering her presence, that delay mattered. Lycera felt it, not as a disruption in thought, but as a pause she could not predict, could not measure. She turned her head slightly to study him again, searching for intention in the small details she was still learning to read. The angle of his shoulders, the set of his jaw, the steady rhythm of his breathing. And still, there was nothing beneath it, no hidden layer to confirm what he might say next. He exhaled slowly, the faintest hint of a smile touching his expression, not amused, not dismissive, just present. You are asking, not ordering, he said, and it was not a question. Lycera felt something shift in her chest, subtle but undeniable, a recognition of the difference that had not existed for her before this moment. Yes, she replied, and the honesty in it felt unfamiliar on her tongue. The room remained still around them, systems humming at a low frequency, distant corridors beyond the sealed door carrying the faintest vibration of movement she could sense, but chose not to follow. For once she did not reach outward, did not gather the countless voices waiting just beyond her awareness. She stayed here, in the silence he created. Ethan nodded once, a simple acknowledgement, and stepped away from the glass, moving toward the center of the chamber with an ease that suggested he had already accepted the space as neutral ground rather than confinement. Then I will stay, he said, and something in the way he said it, not obligated, not coerced, but chosen, settled deeper than any command ever could. Lycera followed a moment later, her movements slower now, deliberate in a different way, as if she were navigating a terrain that did not respond to the senses she had relied on her entire life. She stopped a few feet from him again, maintaining distance but no longer out of control, rather out of awareness. You understand that others will not see this the same way, she said, her tone steady, though beneath it there was a current of something new, not fear, but anticipation of resistance she could already imagine from the council, from the scientists, from anyone who depended on predictability. Ethan tilted his head slightly, considering, because I do not fit into whatever system you built, he said, and again there was no edge to it, no accusation, just observation. She inclined her head in agreement. Because you cannot be read, cannot be verified, cannot be known. The last word came softer than the rest, and she noticed it immediately, the implication embedded within it. Ethan's gaze held hers for a moment. Steady, grounded. You are talking about control, he said, not challenging her, but clarifying. Lycera did not respond right away, because for the first time she could not separate the two. Control and understanding had always been the same thing to her. Until now, she drew in a slow breath, feeling the air move through her lungs without the distraction of 1,000 other signals layered on top of it. Without control, there is risk, she said finally, and the statement sounded smaller in the quiet than it ever had in the noise. Ethan gave a slight nod. as if acknowledging a truth without surrendering to it. Without risk, there is no choice, he replied, and the words settled into the space between them, not as opposition, but as something that existed alongside her own understanding. Lysera turned her gaze briefly toward the closed doors, sensing the distant presence of guards waiting beyond. Their thoughts disciplined but not silent, ready, always ready, and she realized that for the first time, she did not want to open that connection again. Not yet. She looked back at Ethan, at the man she could not read, could not predict, and yet did not feel threatened by in the way she should. They will want answers, she said quietly. Ethan shrugged slightly. The motion relaxed, unconcerned in a way that felt almost impossible in her world. Then maybe you should decide which questions matter, he said. And again, there was no hidden meaning to uncover, just the surface, clear and unguarded. Lysera studied him for a long moment, then did something she had never done in this chamber before. She deactivated the primary neural interface with a single gesture, the faint hum in the walls lowering as the system disengaged. The room becoming not a place of control, but simply a room, and in that quiet, standing across from a man she could not read, she felt something she had never allowed herself to feel before, not certainty, not authority, but the beginning of something far more dangerous and far more human, choice. The quiet settled differently now, no longer a shock or an anomaly, but something that lingered in the edges of the room like a presence that could not be measured. Lysera stood still for a moment after disengaging the neural interface, her senses instinctively reaching outward before she caught herself and let them fall back, the absence of incoming thoughts no longer disorienting, but unfamiliar in a way that required attention, like stepping into open air after a lifetime indoors. Ethan had not moved far. He had taken a slow walk across the chamber, examining the architecture with a casual interest that seemed almost out of place given where he was, his fingers brushing lightly along the smooth surface of a control panel that no longer responded. You turned it off, he said, not looking at her, just stating what he had noticed. Lysera nodded once, though she realized the gesture meant little when he was not watching her directly. Yes, she replied, her voice softer now without the layered resonance of the system amplifying it. It was designed to enhance clarity, but it has always come with noise. She chose the word carefully, aware of how different it sounded now. Ethan glanced over his shoulder, a faint hint of understanding in his expression. Too many voices, he said, and though she could not hear his thoughts, she recognized the accuracy in the way he spoke. Always, she answered, taking a step forward, then another, closing the space between them not out of necessity, but because distance felt different in silence, heavier somehow. From the moment I was born, there has never been a moment without them, she continued, and the admission came easier than she expected, perhaps because she knew he could not reach into it, could not dissect it the way others would. Ethan leaned back slightly against the edge of the inactive console, arms relaxed at his sides. And now there is, he said, not claiming credit, not even implying it, just acknowledging what was. Lysera paused, letting that settle, the simplicity of it, the reality she had never experienced until minutes ago. She focused on her breathing again, the rise and fall steady, uninterrupted, her thoughts her own in a way that felt almost foreign. It is quiet, she said, and the word carried more weight than any formal declaration she had ever made. Ethan gave a small nod. That is what it is supposed to feel like, he replied, and she studied him again, not for hidden meaning, but for understanding. Supposed to, she repeated, as if testing the phrase, because in her world, nothing had ever been defined by what it was supposed to feel like, only by what it achieved, what it controlled, what it maintained. She moved closer again, stopping within a few feet, her posture less rigid now, her hands no longer clasped behind her back in formal stance, but resting naturally at her sides. How do you tolerate it? She asked, and this time it was a genuine question, not an evaluation, not a test. Ethan looked at her directly, his expression thoughtful. I do not tolerate it, he said slowly. I live in it. The distinction echoed through her mind. In a way that required no telepathic amplification, she felt it resonate in the space where constant input used to be. And for a moment, she understood something she had never been taught. That silence was not emptiness, it was space. and space allowed something else to exist, something unforced, something chosen. She turned slightly, glancing toward the sealed doors again, sensing the faint presence beyond without reaching into it, knowing that if she reactivated the system, the quiet would shatter instantly, replaced by the overwhelming flood she had always accepted as normal. And for the first time, she hesitated, not because she feared losing control, but because she did not want to lose this. She looked back at Ethan, her gaze steady, but softer than it had ever been. "If I turn it back on," she said, her voice barely above a breath, "this will disappear." Ethan held her gaze, calm, grounded. "It will still exist," he replied. "You just will not notice it anymore." The answer lingered, simple, undeniable, and Lysera realized that what frightened her was not the silence itself, but the idea that she had lived her entire life without ever noticing it. That something so fundamental could exist alongside her reality and remain unseen. She drew in a slow breath, then exhaled, making no move to reactivate the system, choosing instead to remain in the quiet, just a little longer, standing across from the only mind in the galaxy she could not hear, and beginning to understand that maybe, for the first time, she did not need to. The quiet did not feel fragile anymore. It felt deliberate, like something that could be held if she chose to hold it. And that realization changed the way Lysera stood, the way her shoulders settled, the way her breathing no longer matched a calculated rhythm, but followed something more natural, something she had never trusted before. Across from her, Ethan remained where he was, leaning lightly against the console, his presence unchanged, steady in a way that did not demand attention but inevitably drew it. And for several seconds neither of them spoke, not because there was nothing to say, but because neither of them felt the need to fill the space. The silence itself had become enough, until the faint vibration at the edge of the chamber shifted, subtle but unmistakable. Lysera felt it without reaching for it. A disturbance in the ordered patterns beyond the sealed doors, disciplined thoughts breaking formation, urgency rising. She did not open herself to them, but she recognized the pattern. The council had noticed. Ethan's gaze lifted slightly, not toward the door, but toward her, as if he had sensed the change in her attention rather than the source of it. "Something changed," he said, not as a question. Lysera held still for a moment, weighing the choice in front of her. The system remained offline, the quiet intact, but beyond it the world she had always known was moving, reacting, expecting her to respond as she always had, with clarity, with certainty, with control. "They are coming," she said finally, her voice calm but quieter than before, as if speaking too loudly might fracture the space she had chosen to remain in. Ethan nodded once, absorbing the information without tension. "And they are not going to like this," he added, and again it was not speculation, just a recognition of how systems respond to what they cannot define. Lysera allowed herself a small breath, steady but deeper than before. "No," she said, and for the first time there was no attempt to soften the truth. "They will not." She took a step toward the control interface, her hand lifting slightly, hovering over the activation panel, the familiar instinct returning, the knowledge that with a single motion she could restore everything to its expected state, reconnect to the network, regain total awareness of every mind approaching this room, re-establish control, and yet her hand did not move. The silence remained, surrounding her, anchoring her in a way that no system ever had. Behind her, Ethan shifted his weight slightly, the faint sound grounding her more than any incoming signal could have. "If you turn it back on now," he said quietly, "you will not hear anything different, but you will feel it." She paused, her hand still hovering inches above the panel. "Feel what?" she asked, and this time she did not turn to look at him, because she did not need to see his expression to know he was not speaking to persuade her. "The difference between needing control and choosing it," he replied, and the words settled into the space with a weight that had nothing to do with volume. Lysera lowered her hand slowly. "Not activating the system. Not yet." She turned back to face him, her expression composed but no longer distant. "If I do not reconnect, I will not know what they intend," she said, and there was no fear in it, just acknowledgement. Ethan met her gaze, steady as always. "Then you will have to decide without knowing," he said, and again there was no pressure in it, Just the simple presentation of a path she had never considered before. Lysera let the thought settle, the unfamiliar shape of it. Decision without certainty, action without complete awareness. Everything she had been trained to avoid, and yet standing here, in the only place in the galaxy where her mind was her own, it did not feel like weakness. It felt like something else, something she could not yet define but did not want to lose. The vibration beyond the doors intensified slightly. Footsteps now, coordinated, approaching. The council would not wait long. They never did. She drew in a slow breath, then stepped back from the interface entirely, turning fully toward Ethan, not as a subject to be studied, not as an anomaly to be contained, but as the one constant in a moment where everything else was uncertain. Stay close, she said. And this time there was no hesitation in her voice, not a command, not entirely a request, but something in between, something chosen. And as the chamber doors began to unlock with a soft mechanical sequence, Lysera Vaughn made a decision she had never made before. She chose to face what was coming without hearing it first. The doors opened without sound. A smooth separation of alloy panels that revealed a line of figures waiting just beyond the threshold, their posture precise, their presence controlled. But Lysera did not need her abilities to recognize the tension carried in the way they stood, in the slight rigidity of their shoulders, in the fractionally delayed steps. As they entered the chamber one by one, the council never rushed, but they never hesitated either. And today there was something closer to the latter, a disruption in their usual certainty. The lead counselor stepped forward, tall, composed, his silver markings catching the ambient light as his gaze fixed on Lysera, then shifted briefly to Ethan, assessing, measuring in the only way he could without her assistance. "Your Highness," he said, his voice formal, respectful, but lacking the ease that normally accompanied their interactions. "We detected a complete disengagement from the neural network." Lysera did not move to greet them, did not step forward or incline her head as protocol dictated. She remained where she was, standing in the center of the room with Ethan a few feet behind her, close enough that she could feel the quiet he carried without needing to turn. "I am aware," she replied, her tone even, controlled, but different now, less amplified, more grounded. The counselor's eyes narrowed slightly, not in challenge, but in recalibration. "May we ask why?" he said, and though the question was framed politely, the expectation beneath it was clear: explanation, justification, restoration. Lysera let a single breath pass before answering, not because she needed time to formulate a response, but because she was choosing her words, without the advantage she had always relied on. Because it was necessary, she said, and for the first time, she felt the weight of speaking without knowing exactly how her words would be received. The subtle shifts in expression, the micro-adjustments in posture, these were now her only indicators. The council members exchanged brief glances, their reactions contained but visible. "Necessary for what purpose?" another counselor asked, stepping slightly forward, her tone sharper, more direct. Lysera held her gaze, steady, unflinching. "To understand something I could not perceive while connected," she answered, and the admission carried a quiet gravity that did not need embellishment. The first counselor's attention shifted again to Ethan, lingering this time. "The human," he said, not as a question, but as a conclusion. Lysera did not deny it. "Yes," she replied simply, and the simplicity of that answer seemed to unsettle them more than any elaborate explanation could have, because it left no room for interpretation, no hidden layer they could access. Ethan remained still behind her, not silent out of restraint, but because he had not been asked to speak, and Lysera realized that for the first time, she was standing between him and those who would define him without understanding him. The counselor took another step forward, his presence authoritative, practiced. "Your Highness," with respect. The inability to read a subject presents a significant deviation from established parameters. We cannot assess intent, cannot verify compliance, cannot ensure security. The words came measured, precise, built on logic she had lived by her entire life, and yet now they felt incomplete. Lysera felt the quiet behind her, steady, unchanged, a constant she could not quantify, but could rely on in a way that defied everything she had been taught. "You are describing control," she said, her voice calm, but carrying a subtle firmness that drew their attention more sharply than volume ever could. The counselor paused, just for a moment. "We are describing stability," he corrected. Lysera inclined her head slightly, acknowledging the perspective without conceding to it. "And yet stability built on total visibility is not the same as trust," she replied, and the word hung in the air between them. Unfamiliar in this context, the council exchanged another series of glances, more deliberate this time. "Trust without verification is risk," the second counselor said, her tone steady, unwavering. Lysera felt the truth in that statement, but also its limitation. "And verification without trust is control," she answered, and for the first time, there was a subtle shift in the room that had nothing to do with hierarchy. It was uncertainty, not chaotic, not uncontrolled, but present, undeniable. She took a small step forward, placing herself fully between Ethan and the council, not as a barrier, but as a decision made visible. "He will remain here," she said, and this time it was not a request, not a question, but a declaration chosen without the need to confirm its acceptance. The counselor studied her carefully, weighing not just her words, but the absence of the network behind them, the lack of confirmation he had always relied on, and for a moment, the entire chamber held its breath in a way that had nothing to do with sound, because for the first time, Lysera Vaughn was leading without hearing what came next, and she did not step back. The chamber did not erupt into chaos. It did not fracture under her words, but something far more unsettling took hold, a stillness that did not belong to silence but to uncertainty. The council did not move immediately, and that alone was enough to confirm that something fundamental had shifted. Lysera watched them carefully now, not through the lens of their thoughts, but through the subtle language of presence she was only beginning to understand, the slight tightening of a jaw, the measured delay before a breath, the way their eyes lingered just a fraction longer than before, searching for confirmation they could no longer access. The lead counselor straightened, his posture regaining some of its practiced authority, but the foundation beneath it was no longer absolute. "Your Highness," he said slowly, choosing each word with precision. "This decision introduces variables that cannot be accounted for within our current models." Lysera held his gaze, unflinching. "Then your models are incomplete," she replied, and the statement did not carry defiance, only clarity. The second counselor stepped forward, her tone sharper now, though still controlled. "We are responsible for the stability of an entire system. Uncertainty is not a condition we can allow to persist." Lysera felt the truth in that, the weight of it, the responsibility she had carried her entire life, and yet standing here, in the quiet that still surrounded her, she recognized something else, something that had always been missing from that equation. "Uncertainty already exists," she said, her voice steady. "You have simply never experienced it directly." The words settled heavily, not because they were loud, but because they could not be dismissed without confronting the reality in front of them. Ethan remained behind her, silent, his presence unchanged, and yet Lysera was acutely aware of it, the steady absence that grounded her in a way no system ever had. The lead counselor shifted his attention briefly toward him again, then back to her. "If he cannot be read, then he cannot be trusted," he said, and this time there was no attempt to soften the implication. Lysera did not hesitate. "Trust has never required access," she answered, and the certainty in her voice came not from knowledge, but from choice. The counselor's expression tightened slightly. "Then on what basis do you make that determination?" he pressed, and for the first time, Lysera did not have a framework to rely on, no network to confirm, no layered thoughts to analyze, only what she had observed, what she had experienced in the quiet. She took a slow breath, feeling it fully, then spoke. "On what he has done," she said, and the simplicity of it carried more weight than any calculated argument. The council exchanged another series of glances, their uncertainty no longer hidden. "He has done nothing," the second counselor countered, her tone sharp. Lysera inclined her head slightly, acknowledging the statement. "Exactly," she said, and the word landed differently now, not as dismissal, but as revelation. "He has not resisted, has not attempted to deceive, has not acted outside the boundaries of what has been presented to him." she continued, her voice calm, measured. He has simply existed, and in doing so, revealed a limitation in our understanding. The room held that thought for a moment, the weight of it settling into the space between them. The lead counselor exhaled slowly, a subtle sign of the recalibration happening beneath his composed exterior. And you would base policy on absence, he said, not dismissive, but cautious. Lysera met his gaze without wavering. I would base it on observation, she corrected, not interpretation. And that distinction, small as it seemed, created a fracture in the certainty they had always relied on. The silence that followed was different now. Not just the absence of telepathic input, but the presence of something new, a space where decision was no longer predetermined by complete information, but shaped by what could be seen, what could be chosen. Lysera took one final step forward, her position clear, her presence steady. He remains, she said again. And this time there was no expectation of agreement. Only the declaration of a decision already made. The council did not respond immediately. And in that delay, Lysera realized something she had never understood before. They were experiencing the same thing she had, uncertainty without access. And for the first time, she was not the only one standing in it. And behind her, the silence remained, unbroken, unwavering, no longer something that terrified her, but something she had chosen to protect. No one spoke for several seconds, and in that silence, something irreversible settled into the room, not a decision enforced, not an agreement reached, but a shift that could not be undone. The council members stood where they were, their composure intact, but the certainty that had always defined them now carried a visible fracture. The lead counselor drew in a slow breath, his posture straightening not out of dominance, but out of adaptation. Then we will observe, he said finally, and the words, though simple, marked the first time their system had chosen to wait instead of act. Lysera held his gaze, recognizing the weight of that concession, not as victory, but as acknowledgement, a step into the same uncertainty she had already accepted. The second counselor did not speak again, but her expression softened by a fraction, the sharp edge of resistance replaced by something more measured, more cautious. One by one, the council members inclined their heads, not in full agreement, but in recognition of a path that could no longer be dismissed. And then, just as quietly as they had entered, they turned and stepped back through the open doors, their departure controlled, deliberate, but different now, their movements no longer guided by complete awareness, but by something closer to choice. The chamber doors sealed behind them with a soft magnetic lock, and the moment they did, the room exhaled, not in sound, but in presence. Lysera remained where she was, still facing the place they had stood, her posture steady, but her shoulders no longer carrying the invisible weight she had borne for years. She did not reach for the network, did not reactivate the system. She let the quiet remain, complete and uninterrupted. Behind her, Ethan shifted slightly, the faint sound of his movement grounding her in a way that felt more real than any signal ever had. She turned slowly to face him, her expression composed, but no longer distant. They will adapt, she said, not as reassurance, but as understanding. Ethan gave a small nod, his gaze steady. So will you, he replied, and there was no challenge in it, only recognition. Lysera considered that, the truth of it settling into the space where certainty used to be. She took a step closer, then another, stopping just a few feet from him. The distance no longer defined by protocol, but by awareness. I have spent my entire life hearing everything, she said quietly, her voice carrying a softness that would have been unthinkable before. Every thought, every intention, every hidden fear. She paused, letting the words exist without reaching for confirmation. And I believe that was understanding. Ethan watched her, not interrupting, not filling the silence, just present. She exhaled slowly, the breath steady, unforced. But this, she continued, her gaze steady on his. This is different. She did not try to define it further, did not reduce it to a system or a function, because for the first time, she understood something without needing to name it. Ethan's expression softened slightly, a quiet acknowledgement. Different is not always dangerous, he said, and the words carried a calm certainty that did not need to be proven. Lysera felt that settle into the quiet around them. not as a conclusion, but as something that could grow. She turned her gaze briefly toward the observation glass, the vast darkness beyond stretching endlessly, silent, unmeasured, and for the first time, it did not feel empty. It felt full of possibility. She looked back at him, at the one presence she could not read, could not predict, and no longer needed to stay. She said again, and this time there was no uncertainty in it, not a request shaped by confusion, but a choice made with clarity. Ethan met her gaze, the same steady calm in his eyes, and nodded once. No hesitation, no condition, just agreement. And as the quiet settled fully into the chamber once more, Lyssaravon realized something she had never understood before in a galaxy where every mind could be heard. The one she could not was the only one she could finally trust.